Okay, we will make a start. My name is Gawain Little. I am General Secretary of the General Federation of Trade Unions, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to this evening's Trade Union and Working Class History session. I think one of our most important courses, because as we always say, if we don't understand our history, the history of our movement, and the history of our class, it's really hard to act in the present and to shape our future. So this has been a fantastic series, started in September of this year and has run throughout the year. And this is in fact the very final session in our Trade Union Working Class History series for this year. We'll be starting afresh in September, and I'll say a bit more about that later on. But for now, welcome to the session. There is a behaviour statement in the chat. You can see that there. Please do have a read of the behaviour statement and make sure that behaviour throughout the session is appropriate to where we are in a trade union learning environment. You'll also notice at the bottom of your screen that there's a Q&A box. If you click on there, you can pose questions to our speaker for this evening. Feel free to put questions in throughout the conversation, and after we've heard the presentation, we'll move on to taking those questions that will be put one at a time to this evening's speaker. As I said, this is a really important series, learning from our trade union history, and in fact, a really important session this evening. The Grunwick strike, which we'll be talking about, is one of the most significant events to have taken place in our recent trade union history. The strike lasted for 2 years between 1976 1978 and had a huge impact in terms of the trade union movement in this country, and taught us an awful lot about both the strengths and the weaknesses of the movement and where we need to build and grow. But I won't say any more about that because we have this evening with us a fantastic speaker, Harsev Bains, the national president of the Indian Workers Association. And I'm very, very pleased to welcome Harsev this evening. The Indian Workers Association is a hugely important organisation with which the General Federation of Trade Unions has a very strong relationship. We are very pleased to work together on a number of campaigns, not just looking to the past, but also looking to the future. But this evening, Harsev is here to talk about the Grunwick strike and its importance. So without further ado, I will hand over to Harsev. He will be talking for up to about 45 minutes to present, and then there'll be time for questions afterwards. Please pop your questions in the Q&A at the bottom, and enjoy the presentation and discussion. Harsev, you're really, really welcome, and over to you.
Thank you. Thanks for that wonderful warm welcome, Gawain. And it's a pleasure to be part of this series of education on trade unions and being run by the General Federation of Trade Unions, an organization that we have equal pleasure and delight in working with in solidarity, because there is a lot to offer, and not just in terms of solidarity, but in the very creative way and the initiatives that you are putting forward in terms of education and moving that along. So I'm really delighted to be here this evening to speak about Grunwick, the past, the present, and some of the implications for today as well, with young trade unionists, old trade unionists, and the wonderful people that are joining. And I see people are joining in from Kilburn and Greenford in mine, because I come from West London, so it's my neck of the woods, and it's so lovely to see their names popping up on there. So look forward to what they have to say later on. I will be using a PowerPoint. I hope it won't be death by PowerPoint, but certainly I always find it's useful to use, because otherwise we can just ramble on, and it's nice to get all the important data out and share that what was going on at the time. Because it may seem like a long time ago, but in trade union terms, in history, in working class history, it really isn't a very long time. And I started thinking about the title, Grunwick. What did it mean for me? I was fairly young at the time when they started in 1976. I was actually at a college in Willesden doing my HNC. So it goes back a long way. And it wasn't just for me, it wasn't just about trade unions. It was a catalyst for human rights. Um, and so I've titled it that, and because I think it touched upon so many aspects of trade unionism and so many aspects of society at the time. And it'd be interesting to see and hear if you think the society's really moved on from that. So let's start here. So if we can move on to the next slide. So what was happening pre-1976? Well, I was young enough or old enough, whatever you want to think about it, to remember 1968. I'd come into the country only a couple of years earlier as a young person invited by my parents. 1968, Enoch Powell makes this speech, Member of Parliament. He was like the ideologue of the Conservative Party, with the same sort of scaremongering you hear these days, about influx of immigrants. The rivers of blood speech, many will know of that. But quite often they forget the other aspect of his speech, which was a mention of country of strangers in the same speech. And he was alarmed by the number of people coming to this country, something we still hear today. So what was going on? 1960s and 70s, many Asians, mainly Indian and Pakistani origin, who were technically British citizens, were expelled from Kenya and Uganda. They had gone there, number had gone there since 1834 onwards, a year after the end of the slave trade. These were the indentured laborers. That's how they ended up in Africa and different parts of the world. And they had gone there and been given British citizenship so that they felt that they could travel and be part of Britain. August 1972, and I remember it as yesterday, President Idi Amin had come to power and gave a 90-day notice for the Asians to leave. Alarmed by this, in the city I lived in, city of Leicester, the council there sent a group of people to Africa to ask the Asians there not to come to Leicester. So you can guess what happened. These people came to Leicester. Similarly, other towns had said, don't come here, but, wherever you have some friends and family, that's people where they're going to meet. We had a conservative government at the time. Edward Heath, or Ted Heath, as he was popularly known, was the prime minister. And I remember that part of the people, when we started working as an apprentice, we would get a wage rise linked to the inflation. And it was quite bizarre. You get a weekly wage rise because inflation was going up to such an extent. We had 3-day week, and a lot of disputes were going on. At the same time, as I said, I grew up in Leicester. In 1974, there was a strike at Imperial Typewriters, where people had discovered, Asians had discovered that they were getting a lot less money for the same work being done by their white colleagues. My sister happened to be in the accounts department at the time, and so I do remember these conversations around that because it just arose out of pure accidental work that the women had seen the wage slip had been accidentally given to somebody else, and they said, well, why is this person getting more than I am? And so if we can just move on. So move on to 1976. And we're hearing at the moment, that this is one of the hottest and driest summer. But 1976 was the hottest and driest summer on record. I recall having pumps installed down the street for us to go and fill buckets of water to bring home for cooking and drinking. So it really was hot, it was dry, and went on for months. And as I said, the expelled Asians that had come from East Africa were processed via holding centers, a bit like they do with refugees today. And a number of them then relocated in Leicester and London. London, they came via Southall and places like that. West London, then ended up in Wembley after a few years. But these were educated people. especially the female folks, they were also educated. And some of these people coming from East Africa from middle class families, I would say well-to-do families, perhaps not even used to working in production and factories, but nonetheless took up the challenge of adapting to the life here. We had a Labour government at the time. Harold Wilson was in as Prime Minister from 1974, having taken over from Ted Heath. But strangely enough, suddenly in 1976, he stepped down, and James Callaghan, who I believe was the foreign minister at the time, became the Prime Minister. And for those from West London and London area, you might even remember on 4th June 1976, Gurdeep Chaggar was racially murdered in Southall. The first racial murder that we knew of, and which had really brought the communities together. And people had started to demand rights and stand up for their rights. Moving on. Next slide. So 20th August 1976, the same year, we are the lions or the lionesses, as you can see from the image there. What you run here is not a factory. It is a zoo. There are monkeys here who dance to your tune, but there are also lions here who can bite your head off. And we are the lions, Mr. Manager. I want my freedom. With these words, uttered in the middle of the long, hot summer of 1976, the 43-year-old Jayaban Desai, a 5'2", maybe inches tall lady, but a giant of a trade unionist that she turned out to be, stormed out of the Grunwick film processing laboratories in London. Film processing laboratories or production, some of you may recall, where we used to send rolls of film to be developed, and prints were then posted out to our home addresses. You had things like bonus print, true print, and such like, and they were one of the people that were doing this. Mrs. Desai triggered one of the most significant industrial disputes in modern history. This became a catalyst for trade union recognition, women's rights, equality, and justice. And although on the first day there were only 4 or 5 that walked out, but within days, they were joined by 137 out of the 500 staff who came and stood on the picket lines through thick and thin and started the struggle that went on over the next 2 years. The demand was quite simple: union recognition and an end to the arbitrary and humiliating management in the workplace. Next slide. What were those working conditions? As I said, the Grunwick Film Processing Laboratories at Dollis Hill, this is in the suburb of Willesden area, were established by George Ward and colleagues, a very right-wing ideology-based person. They employed mainly South Asian women, about 80% of them, and 10% from the Afro-Caribbean, and about 10% from the indigenous white population, as they were considered as cheap labor and hardworking and docile. In other words, they'll come and do their work and do as they were told. In fact, the employers went and placed adverts all around their localities and said, come and join us and we'll give you a job. And these Asian workers went to their families and friends and naturally attracted them to that same place. But the company conducted its business in an atmosphere of fear and control. And the managers, when they wanted to reprimand or admonish an employee, did it in full view. What they termed a glass cabinet, or what we nowadays see as a fishbowl. In other words, you're visible to all your colleagues and know, oh, well, so-and-so is in trouble because they've been called in. To try and get, to humiliate you as much as possible, so that there's no way you're going to ask and argue your position. And it really was to humiliate the individual and the worker. Workers had to obtain permission to go to the toilets. No dignity or respect. Now you can imagine what it's like for women, especially if they're going through a pregnancy or anything like that, to go and ask a male supervisor, can I go to the toilet, sir? And as I said, these people had come from East Africa, where they weren't used to being treated in this manner, and nobody should be treated in this manner. It was a degrading treatment, especially for the unskilled non-white immigrant workers. And again, I would add this was not just at Grunwick, but it was typical of the working conditions at the time. Low pay, generally, from imperial typewriters to this, that low pay for migrant workers, long hours, with very little benefits. There's no pension involved, compulsory overtime. It was considered that, yeah, if you started at 8, that doesn't mean that you finished by 5 or 4 or 6. They were asked to work till 10 o'clock at night, overtime at a minute's notice, without any pre-warning. So the women would have a job of work to do at the workplace. And if there are any females listening in or watching this at the end, and you know that by and large, and it still happens today, that they have a job of work to do at home, to go and cook, to clean, to prepare for the next day. So the work didn't end there. Conditions were absolutely awful. And you can add to this, I'm sure the list is endless, you know, the sort of horrific conditions people had to work in. Right, next. In steps a union, the Association of Professional, Executive, Clerical, and Computer Staff, otherwise known as APEX. Now, the striking workers, 137 of them, joined APEX. Quite often, trade unions say, no, you have to be a member for 6 months before they'll support you. But this doesn't seem to be as stringently applied here. 6th of September, 1976, Roy Grantham, the General Secretary, spoke at the Trade Union Congress and said that the Grunwick workers were on strike against a reactionary employer who was taking advantage of race and employing workers on disgraceful terms and conditions. I believe Len Murray was the General Secretary at the time of the TUC. The workers who went on strike were sacked. So there was little scope for negotiation at that point as far as they were concerned. The dispute escalated and drew national and international attention and status. The picket line was swelling by the day. The word was getting out, especially in the West London area and through the Indian community and the Asian community, about the strike that was taking place. There was solidarity from trade unionists, students, Indian Workers Association, the unorganized workers, anti-racist and feminist groups, as well as political parties on the British left. And I could again add that there were some religious institutions as well, some secular democratic religious institutions that also supported their struggle. Seeing this swelling of picket lines, the employers' attitudes ideologically hardened. Instead of sitting and negotiating, they were being driven by another force, the political force that was to come in 79 under Margaret Thatcher. Right, next. 11th July, 1977. This is the next year. It was a national day of action. 20,000 plus people gathered in solidarity at the Grunwick processing plant in the suburbs of Dollis Hill. They didn't quite have those chimneys, but that's just to show the industrial climate as it was at the time. Next. Something else that was happening in the background. A special police patrol group, an elite paramilitary style squad trained to deal with public disorder and acts of terrorism was deployed in this industrial dispute. There were more than 550 arrests during the strike, the largest number of any industrial dispute since the general strike of 1926. And you got to remember, general strike of 1926, 3 million people were out on strike. After one particularly brutal day in November 1977, and I believe this is when the NUM had also joined us on the picket lines. 243 pickets were treated for injuries, 12 with broken bones. Now, this obviously caught the media's attention, which were reporting on this on and off, especially the Morning Star. But the unrest made the front pages of the national press with the pickets and not the police portrayed as the instigators of the violence. Now, some of us experienced that in West London a couple of years later. In 1979, in Southall, West London, experienced the Special Patrol Group when over 700 people were arrested, 342 charged, and Blair Peach killed. We saw what a police state looks like. And so if it hadn't been attacked in November, it was a stark reminder of what this SPG was all about. And this was happening, unfortunately, under Labour Party and the Labour government. The SPG was widely deployed by Margaret Thatcher as well in the 1984 miners' strike. And it was finally disbanded in 1987, but only, one would argue, to be replaced by the Territorial Support Group, which hasn't been as political as the SPG was deployed. And it really was a shocking example of, or a stark example of what a police state could look like. Right, next slide, please. The political pressure that was being applied on the strikers. On 26th June 1977, Prime Minister James Callaghan applied a lot of political pressure on the Home Secretary, Merlin Rees, to have the Met Police proactively engaged. His concern wasn't to bring about a peaceful end, a negotiated settlement to the strike, and the recognition of trade unions or the reinstatement of the workers. But he's more mindful of the danger of bringing the government down. So on 30th June, a few days later, the government appointed Lord Scarman to lead a court of inquiry to examine the ins and outs of the strike, and to come up with a recommendation or a set of recommendations. On 10th July, the same year, the right-wing National Association for Freedom, this is who George Ward and others were affiliated with, launched Operation Pony Express to circumvent the postal boycott and deliver processed photographs. Now, of course, because otherwise, if they were bringing in strike breakers to process the films and develop the photographs, but they couldn't actually send them out in the post because the postal workers were rendering solidarity action. Things you wouldn't be allowed to do these days. Union of Postal Workers, who initially supported the strike, later on, under this pressure, called off the Cricklewood postal workers to end their boycott of Grunwick. So their photographs started to flow again and were being posted out. The alliance that had so far sustained the industrial action began to splinter. People start to break away, and it became more and more unsustainable. And the TUC, who initially had supported it, had invited Mrs. Desai to even address their Congress, and who had attended many, many trade union rallies and conferences, found themselves short of this support. The TUC withdrew its support for mass picketing, and it became quite obvious that this was now going to be a pretty uphill struggle to carry on. So this is why people talk about what started it, and perhaps was there a sense of betrayal that led us to this? Right. Next, please. Jai Desai, born in Gujarat, working in growing up in East Africa, then going back to India, would have known about Mahatma Gandhi and his tactics of going on hunger strikes. Went on a hunger strike in November 1977. And few fellow strikers were on a strike outside the TUC with her and sat outside for a resumption of mass, calling for a resumption of mass pickets. If you want to see the images at that time, I believe Morning Star has some images which you may be able to dig up and share. I'm always a bit mindful of the copyright, so don't like to put them out. This attempt, unfortunately, was unsuccessful in convincing the TUC under Len Murray, who had initially given it support, but he wasn't obviously the only one. The General Council would have made such a decision not to back them under this all sorts of pressure that we talked about. Okay, next, please. So we move on 2 years later to summer 1978. With the TUC support being withdrawn, the postal workers compromised, with police repression or oppression, political pressure from government, the right-wing attacks on pickets, and you got to remember these were majority of Asian women pickets who were on the picket lines, being attacked by National Front, by other people, racist thugs. The Lord Scarman's recommendations, and I see somebody put in the chat line that George Ward wasn't cooperating. Well, they came up with the recommendations to recognize the union and reinstate the sacked workers, but these were rejected by the Grunwick management and could not be enforced. The striking women were left feeling disillusioned with the trade union movement, but as Jayaban Desai put it, official support from the TUC was like honey on the elbow. You can smell it, you can feel it, but you cannot taste it. Next, please. After 2 long years, a new beginning. Because of us, the people who stayed in Grunwick got a much better deal. When the factory moved, the van used to come to their home and pick them up because it was difficult for them to get to the new place. Can you imagine that? And they get a pension today. And we get nothing. That was because of us, because of our struggle. And Jayaban Desai, the lioness born on 2nd April 1933 in Gujarat, India, continued her roar until 23rd December 2010 to inspire workers from all backgrounds, black, white, males and females. And strikes that followed across Britain have been led by Asian women. I recall one at Chicks. These are strikes that I'm personally been familiar with. Chicks, this was in Slough, in Buckinghamshire. Hillingdon hospital workers in West London strike, and this lasted 5 years. Started in 1995 against Pall Mall, and these women were being asked to receive a £40 wage cut. These were cleaning staff. 5 years they battled it out for their reinstatement of their workers, and also recognition of the unions. This was inspiration they drew from the Grunwick strike. The LSG Sky Chefs at Heathrow, they're just an example of some of the work that and some of the struggles that women have led, how they've inspired us in the trade union movement to battle and struggle for a better today and a better tomorrow. Next, please. Okay, some contemporary struggles. So I said it's just as important when we're recalling the past to recognize what's going on around us. And you hear that the questions or the hostile environment being created for labor people in trade unions, people not in trade unions at workplaces. The employment laws, I understand, are now going to be changed under this government. Let's see what actually comes out of the House. I know some of the documents that have been put together by people like Lord John Handy and others. So let's actually see what emerges and what changes are implemented. But some of the things that we had then of solidarity actions are things that remain a dream for workers to be able to support one another, as we should, of members of the working class. So first thing that comes to my mind is modern slavery. I mentioned the indentured laborers of 1834, a year after the officially ending the year of slavery in 1833. Well, we have modern slavery taking place right now. Whether you look at social care workers, how they've been brought in especially from South India and from parts of Asia, where they're exploited at the initial point by scrupulous agents and coming in and then working here for agencies, not paid the wages that they were promised, not given the working conditions that they were promised. In fact, quite often after 3 months, are being pushed out again so that the same social care or elderly care, whatever the center is, can invite somebody else over and make more money out of that individual. It is one of the biggest scams going on right now where these people are being exploited. We again are, through our organization and through working with people like GFTU and others, encouraging people to join trade unions to try and safeguard their interest. There's the exploitation of international students who are being asked to do 200 days, now 200 working days. That's almost a year of free labor. 200 days of free labor in terms of internships. And this is not being done just in social care sector. We've started to develop a database that is picking these up. These people are even by law firms who should know better and should be setting examples, are leading on this, where they employ people, give them money and say, now give it back. People just merely to get something on their CVs are doing this free service. And trade unions and trade unionists cannot sit idly by and allow this to happen without rendering solidarity and support. The living wage violations. Again, this is going on, and I think everybody's aware of it, and we know where it happens. And because it's migrants, we turn a blind eye. Oh, well, it's somebody else. They shouldn't be working anyway. We forget they're working class, they're workers. The 0-hour contracts. And you hear a lot about the undocumented migrants. There's been many calls for them to be regularized so that they can make a contribution to the British economy in a proper way through taxation and be protected in terms of healthcare, in terms of social care, and be paid a decent wage, a living wage, and not live in constant fear of threat. Then, of course, we still have this non-unionized workers in this new economy, whether they're at these huge warehouses that have popped up and down the country from Amazon and other equally large distribution centers, where they are being treated in the same way, that you have to get permission to go to the toilet. You are treated in the same way as people were in or a similar way as people were in 1976. This is why I said at the beginning, we have to think and ponder over and reflect upon what changes have we actually brought about and try and protect those changes, because it's more about protection at the moment and rather than trying to get new and improved working conditions, which of course we should be fighting for. But quite often, sadly, it's the protection that we're not doing. It's not getting enough people to join trade unions, not saying it often enough how important it is for people to be in a trade union, to be educated about trade unionism and work within that. And I have spent 40 years as a trade unionist. I started in 1976 with the National Union of Railway Workers as an apprentice in the Underground, London Underground. Then moved on and joined the EETPU as it was then. Before that, it was the ETU, Electricians Trade Unions. Then the EETPU, pretty much a right-wing union at the time, and I think it's Frank Chappell, for a major airline as electrician, which I joined. And then into, I think it became Amicus, then Unite, because it kept evolving and changing, and retired as a member of Unite, still linked to Unite. I believe in trade unionism. I think I'm pleased that there are many people joining this evening's class. It's important that even despite the frustrations, Jeb and Desai and her colleagues stuck to trade unionism. In fact, she found it extremely difficult to land and secure a job and employment following the end of the strike. And it took almost 2 years for her to get employment, even with Brent Council, because this is where this company was based. She did finally get some employment, but never the recognition that I think really she was due and her colleagues were due for having set us on this path of recognizing our rights and standing up for our rights. I know it's a little bit shorter than the 45 minutes, but hopefully give you more opportunity to ask questions. I'll stop there. Thank you. Any questions and answers?